The blizzard roared across the barren land like a beast set loose from its cage. Snowflakes swirled in frenzied gusts, blanketing the world in a cold, unforgiving white. Visibility was reduced to mere feet, and the relentless wind cut through the air with a biting sharpness that left no warmth for the soul. It was a storm that had come out of nowhere, an angry force of nature that cared little for the lives it threatened to swallow. In a small, isolated cabin on the edge of nowhere, Aaima cradled her 2 young children, Emily and Jake, her arms wrapped tightly around them for warmth. The fire in the hearth had long since died down to embers, and with each passing hour, the cold crept deeper into the walls of the cabin. Outside, the wind howled as if it were a living thing, clawing at the doors and windows, determined to break through. Inside, Aima's heart pounded as she tried to keep her children calm, though she could feel the heavy weight of panic pressing down on her chest. The storm was more than just a fight for warmth, it was a battle for survival. Aaima had already spent days rationing food and struggling to keep the fire alive, but now, with the blizzard intensifying, she knew it wasn't enough. The road to safety was miles away, but with the storm closing in, the chances of making it out were fading with each passing moment. Aaima had no choice but to face the truth. If help didn't come soon, she might lose everything she had left. But somewhere, beyond the storm, a figure was riding through the blinding snow, unaware that their paths were about to cross in the most unexpected way. The night dragged on, the howling wind outside pressing against the fragile walls of the cabin. Aaima sat on the cold wooden floor, Emily's head resting on her lap and Jake nestled beside her. She tried to keep them warm, wrapping them in the thin blankets she had left, but it was no use. The chill had crept into their bones, making everything feel heavier, colder. Her breath came out in visible clouds, a constant reminder of the battle she was losing against the storm. The fire had gone out hours ago, and though Aaima had tried everything she knew to restart it, the damp wood and the relentless cold made it impossible. The little food she had left, a few cans of beans and a loaf of stale bread, was barely enough for a meal, let alone to keep them going through the worst of the storm. She had rationed as best as she could, but now, with the wind intensifying and no end to the blizzard in sight, Aaima couldn't escape the sinking feeling in her stomach. The storm had trapped them here, miles from the nearest town, and the power was out. There was no way to contact anyone for help. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice weak. "Are we going to be okay?" Aaima forced a smile, brushing a stray lock of hair from her daughter's face. Her heart broke at the question. How could she promise that they would be all right when she had no idea herself? "We're going to be okay, sweetheart. We just need to stay warm and wait for the storm to pass," Aaima replied, though the words sounded hollow even to her. She had been saying the same thing over and over, but deep down, she knew that waiting wasn't enough. They needed more than just patience. They needed a miracle. Outside, the storm seemed to grow fiercer by the minute, the wind now shrieking like a wounded animal. The snow piled up rapidly, blocking any hope of escape. Aaima tried to push aside the gnawing fear that they might never make it out, but it clung to her like a shadow, growing darker with each passing second. Just as she began to wonder if the storm would be the end of them, a faint sound broke through the blizzard, the distant thudding of hooves, cutting through the roaring wind like a sign from the heavens. Aaima stiffened, straining to listen. Could it be? Could someone actually be out there, braving the storm to help them? She held her breath, praying that the answer was yes. Caleb McAllister had never been one to shy away from the brutal winters of the high plains. His sprawling ranch sat miles away from the nearest town, tucked in the shadow of jagged mountains that seemed to guard it fiercely. Caleb had inherited the land from his father, and over the years, he had poured his heart and soul into it. Now, it was more than just property. It was a testament to his perseverance and grit. On this particular evening, however, the wind was relentless, and the storm was like nothing Caleb had ever seen before. He had known the storm was coming, but the ferocity of it still caught him off guard. He had been in the barn, tending to his horses, when the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that even his seasoned cattle, usually calm in the face of rough weather, were agitated and restless. He knew there were others in the area, ranchers, farmers, families who lived on the outskirts. As much as he wanted to stay inside, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that someone might need help. He grabbed his weathered coat, his thick gloves, and saddled Thunder, his most trusted horse. Caleb and Thunder had weathered many storms together, and tonight would be no different. With a flick of his reins, They set off into the swirling snow, Caleb squinting against the wind, his eyes searching for any sign of life through the thickening white fog. As he rode through the driving snow, Caleb's thoughts turned to his own losses. His wife had passed away years ago in a tragic accident, and since then, his days had become a blur of work and solitude. Despite his wealth, the empty spaces around him felt cold, even when the ranch was alive with activity. But tonight, that loneliness seemed distant. There was something else on his mind. It wasn't just the storm or the ranch. It was the thought that someone, somewhere, might need him. He rode for hours, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath heavy and warm in the freezing air. Thunder's hooves cut through the snow with steady precision, but even the old horse's strength was tested. As they pushed forward, Caleb caught sight of something in the distance, a faint glow, barely visible through the flurry of snowflakes. The dim light flickered like a beacon, and his instincts told him to head toward it. It was a cabin. And inside, someone was waiting for help. The cabin loomed out of the storm like a fragile silhouette, its light barely piercing the fury of the blizzard. Caleb urged Thunder forward, his heart pounding with the weight of the storm and the strange urgency that had overtaken him. The closer he got, the more he realized that the light wasn't just the glow of a fireplace or a lantern. It flickered with a desperate kind of hope. Someone was inside, and they were waiting. As Caleb dismounted outside the cabin, the wind howled so fiercely that it nearly stole his breath. His boots sank into the thick snow, and his eyes scanned the door, which was barely visible beneath a thick layer of ice and snow. He knocked, the sound of his fist muffled by the wind. No answer. Caleb knocked again, harder this time, and this time the door creaked open just enough for a faint silhouette to appear in the doorway. A woman stood there, her face pale from the cold, her eyes wide with disbelief. She seemed too thin, her face drawn, her clothes barely enough to ward off the chill. Caleb's heart skipped a beat as he took in her worn-out appearance. Her eyes, though tired, carried the weight of both fear and relief. "Are you?" Caleb's voice cut through the storm, raspy from the freezing air. "Are you all right?" The woman blinked, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then, slowly, as if she were still unsure the vision before her was real, she stepped back, motioning for him to enter. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. We need help." Caleb stepped inside without hesitation, the warmth of the cabin hitting him like a wave. He could barely make out the figures of two small children sitting near the fire, their faces flushed from the heat but still pale from the cold. He took in the scene, bare, sparse, and a world away from the comfort of his ranch. The fireplace had long since died down to embers, and the food on the table was minimal, barely enough for the woman and her children to survive another day. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the distant roar of the blizzard outside. The woman's eyes were filled with gratitude, but also a quiet desperation. She didn't speak at first, as if unsure how to begin. Caleb could see the exhaustion in her face, how the fight to stay alive had drained her, leaving her with nothing but a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, help had come. "I'm Aaima," she said finally, her voice shaky. "These are my kids, Emily and Jake. We've been trying to stay warm. The storm's been getting worse. We ran out of food 2 days ago, and the fire's almost gone. I didn't know what to do. I thought we might freeze before the storm passed." Caleb's gaze softened as he took in the small family. Emily, a girl no older than 7, clutched a ragged doll to her chest, her wide brown eyes flicking up to Caleb. Jake, barely 4, rested his head on his mother's lap, his tiny body curled against her for warmth. Caleb's heart clenched at the sight. The storm raged outside, but in this cabin, in the presence of Aaima and her children, something shifted in Caleb. This wasn't just a chance meeting. This was fate, an unexpected collision between two worlds, brought together by the relentless force of nature. Caleb's mind raced, but his body moved with calm determination. "Don't worry, Aaima. You're not alone anymore," Caleb said firmly, his voice steady. He turned to the children, offering a warm, comforting smile. "We'll get you to safety. You're going to be all right." Aima's eyes welled with tears as she looked at him, too overwhelmed to speak. It wasn't just the storm that had brought her to the brink, it was the weight of losing everything. But now, standing in front of a stranger, a millionaire rancher no less, Aaima could feel a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in days: hope. With a quiet nod, Caleb knew what needed to be done. The storm may have trapped them in this cabin, but it wouldn't keep them here forever. And with that, Caleb's journey to save them had just begun. Caleb didn't waste a moment. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing against the cabin, and the more he looked around, the more he realized just how fragile their situation had become. The storm was far from letting up, and staying in the cabin wasn't an option. If they were to survive, they needed to leave, and they needed to do it soon. He turned to Aaima, who was sitting on the floor with her children, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. The fire was nothing more than dying embers, and the air in the cabin was frigid. It was clear that staying here, no matter how much they huddled together, wouldn't be enough. "We have to leave," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. Aima's eyes widened in shock. "Leave? In this storm?" she whispered, incredulous. "There's no way we'll make it. We'll freeze before we even get out of the yard." Caleb understood her fear. The storm was fierce, and the wind howled like an animal on the hunt. But he knew one thing for certain: if they stayed, they would die. The snow would bury the cabin, and the cold would finish them off. "I know it's hard to believe, but we have a better chance of making it to my ranch. We have to move before the storm gets worse. The barn's not far from here, and it'll give us shelter for the night," Caleb explained, his eyes scanning the children, who looked both frightened and confused. Aaima hesitated, but Caleb's words carried weight. She could see the resolve in his eyes, the calm certainty that gave her no room to argue. For a moment, she thought about the possibility of staying, of holding on to what little warmth was left. But the truth was undeniable. The storm was growing stronger by the minute. They had to move. "All right," Aaima said, her voice trembling. "But what about the kids? They're too young to ride." Caleb's gaze softened. "I'll take care of that. You can ride with me behind Thunder. I'll make sure the kids stay safe. We'll make it." Thunder, Caleb's sturdy horse, stood ready outside the cabin, his breath visible in the cold air. Caleb had trained him for situations just like this, through blizzards and freezing nights. He trusted his horse as much as he trusted his own instincts. Caleb moved quickly, gathering blankets, some spare food, and a few extra layers of clothing. He didn't have much time, but he knew it was enough. He helped Aaima and her children prepare as quickly as he could, wrapping them in the warmth they needed. He would get them through this storm, no matter the cost. "Stay close to me," Caleb said, as he led them out into the blizzard, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We'll make it, I promise." With that, they set off, Caleb leading the way through the storm, Thunder cutting through the snow with steady steps. It was a long way to safety, but Caleb was determined. This was their only chance. The moment Caleb and Aaima stepped outside the cabin, the storm hit them like a wall. The wind was so fierce it almost knocked them off their feet, and the snow swirled around them in thick, blinding sheets. Caleb pulled his coat tighter, shielding his face as the icy gusts stung his skin. Thunder, his horse, stood stoically nearby, his hooves crunching in the deep snow, as if ready for whatever came next. Aaima clutched Emily and Jake to her chest, the chill making her muscles ache. Caleb quickly motioned for her to mount Thunder behind him, a steady presence amid the chaos of the storm. It was difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Snow and wind obscured everything, and the world had narrowed into a whirling void of white. But Caleb's confidence gave Aaima a strange sense of peace. She knew she had no choice but to trust him now. With a swift motion, Caleb urged Thunder forward, and they began their trek through the blizzard. The horse's hooves cut through the snow with rhythmic precision, each step deliberate and sure despite the fierce winds. Caleb had ridden through storms like this before, but nothing had ever felt quite as urgent. Every second counted. Behind him, Aaima clung tightly to him, her arms wrapped around his waist, trying to shield her children from the worst of the cold. Emily's head rested against her shoulder, and little Jake was pressed against her, shivering uncontrollably. They could barely see through the storm, their faces frozen and raw from the wind. But Caleb's steady movements kept them grounded, guiding them through the fury of the blizzard. The terrain was treacherous, uneven ground, deep snowdrifts, and the constant barrage of wind made every step feel like a battle. Caleb kept his eyes on the path, his senses sharp despite the blinding storm. He knew the land better than anyone. He had to. The way to the barn wasn't far, but in conditions like this, distance could be deceiving. Hold on tight, Caleb shouted over the howling wind, his voice barely carrying. Aaima nodded, though she wasn't sure if he could see her through the storm. Her heart raced with both fear and determination. Every minute they spent in the blizzard felt like an eternity, and she feared they wouldn't make it. But Caleb didn't falter. With every mile, his confidence steadied her. He was their anchor in this violent storm. As they pressed forward, Aaima clung to the hope that the shelter of the barn was just ahead, that safety was still possible if they could only survive this night. Thunder's steady pace cut through the storm like a lifeline, and as they pushed forward, the only thing Aaima could do was hold on and pray. After what felt like an eternity, Caleb led them to the barn, its dark outline barely visible through the storm. The shelter was a welcome sight, and Caleb dismounted quickly, helping Aaima and the children down. The cold had seeped into their bones, but the warmth inside the barn was a relief. Caleb worked swiftly, building a fire with dry wood he had stored nearby. The flames crackled, casting a soft glow as Aaima wrapped her children in blankets. Exhausted, she sank to the ground, her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. They had made it, against all odds. The storm had passed by morning, leaving a quiet, frozen world outside. Inside the barn, Aaima and her children had slept soundly, warmth and safety a luxury they hadn't known in days. Caleb led them to his ranch later that day, where they were welcomed with open arms. Over the following weeks, Aaima began to heal, physically, emotionally, and mentally. Caleb's support gave her the strength to rebuild. The bond between them deepened, not just out of gratitude, but of mutual understanding. The blizzard had brought them together, and in its aftermath, they found something far more lasting, a new beginning. The storm that had once threatened to tear them apart had, in the end, forged a bond stronger than either Aaima or Caleb could have imagined. What had begun as a desperate struggle for survival in the face of nature's fury blossomed into something unexpected: hope, connection, and healing. Aaima, once alone and lost in the relentless battle of grief and survival, now found herself surrounded by warmth, support, and a future that seemed uncertain only a few days ago. Caleb, too, had been transformed. The loneliness that had followed his wife's death began to fade as he witnessed Aima's resilience and the joy of seeing her children thrive. In the midst of the harshest blizzard, they had discovered something beautiful: the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the belief that even in the darkest times, help can come when you least expect it.